All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third Tecnoglass series of the spring, Tecnoglass lecture of the spring series. I'm Joel Lemire, curator of this series and director of the graduate programs in architecture at University of Miami School of Architecture. Tonight, we are fortunate to have Brandon Clifford joining us to discuss his work and its context. But as always, before we dive in, I need to emphasize how lucky we are to have this lecture series at all. It has been an immeasurable pleasure, actually, for me to invite some of my favorite designers and thinkers here to mix it up with us and to lend their insights, let's say, to our collective intellectual project or culture. The whole thing has been made possible only through the support of Tecnoglass, our sponsor. So our ambition is matched by their generosity, and for that, I wholeheartedly thank Tecnoglass. One quick note for those here and on Zoom that for those seeking AIA continuing education credits, you need to email Stephen Fett, SFETT at miami.edu. All right, now to the better stuff. All right, so here we are halfway through the spring semester, having already hosted Virginia Sanfrantello and Felicia Davis, and we have Sean Canty and Philippe Bloch on the near horizon. But we could not have had a better anchor at the midpoint of this series than our speaker tonight, Brandon Clifford. In the broad terrain that is, let's say, the materially focused research and design world, Brandon has been a leading voice for more than a decade at this point. And so when I craft a description for a lecture series such as this, titled Operating in Material Conditions and Architectural Imaginaries, his body of work is, let's say, already there, right? It's already there as subtext. That work represents a critical strain of research that shares explicitly or not the central thesis for our theme for this semester, which is that to accomplish the revolutionary changes required of a responsible architecture, we must reinvent the matter that constitutes it. Now, there are a lot of different ways to speak about Brandon's work, though each shares, I would say, a certain through line about how to invent this architectural matter, to think about the stuff with which we build. For me, it would be a lot of fun, at least, to indulge in some lengthy analysis of those various framings. Maybe we could start with Brandon's aversion towards layered systems, those industrially produced and mono-purpose sheets that make up most conventional construction, and how that led to his enduring turn towards solids. Or perhaps we could address his formal inclinations, which managed to expertly ride the line between the exuberant plasticity of the digital and the deterministic or inevitable geometries engendered by physical behaviors and simulation. Or of course, these days we could contextualize his work in the contemporary discourse around ecologies, where Brandon's vision of a post-extractive future explicitly seeks lessons from the past. Maybe you can tell that it's hard for me, but I will resist the urge to analyze all of these things at length in favor of letting him have a few words of his own. So to that end, I will cut short his long list of achievements and accolades to point out just a few. He is an associate professor at MIT, a Rome Prize recipient, a TED Fellow, SOM Prize winner. His latest book, The Cannibal's Cookbook, is a remarkable mix of serious research and whimsical speculation. He also runs Matter Design with partners Wes McGee and Joanna Lobdell, an award-winning practice recognized and published widely, including by the Boston Design Biennial and Architecture League Prize for Young Architects and Designers. Now, generally, I would try to disarm Brandon, someone I've known and called a friend for a long time, with some good-natured jab or maybe an underhanded compliment. It's just the kind of relationship that we have. But I've decided to do something a little bit more provocative today. And hopefully, Brandon, this doesn't throw you off your game too much. And instead, I'll be completely earnest for a moment instead. Brandon is simply the best designer in the entirety of our peer group. Among all those who share these intellectual affinities that we have and who work in mediums involving digital making of any kind, none are better than Brandon. So on behalf of the School of Architecture and at University of Miami and Tecnoglass, please join me in welcoming Brandon Clifford.
Oh. Thank you for having me. It's really wonderful to be here. And Joel, thank you for that introduction. That means a lot. I mean, many of the things that I'm going to share today really emerged from conversations that we've had over the years of you pushing me and challenging me to sharpen my arguments and bring your philosophical stance on what could otherwise just be design work. So I really appreciate that mentorship. Today, we're going to be connecting two very different worlds. We're going to connect heavy, gravity-laden objects of the real physical world with floaty, ephemeral ideas of the imaginary world. So please sit back, relax, enjoy yourself, because we're just going to travel through time and talk about some big old stones. This is an infamous image of the revered Moai of Rapa Nui, or Easter Island. I want to be clear that this is an image of the quarry. This is the source location that these Moai emerge from the earth. But this is an image of the Moai in their final resting position on one of the many Ahu platforms encircling this tiny island in the Pacific. But from a Western point of view, we can look at these statues and analyze them for their proportions, the story they tell through their figuration and their placement, and wonder at the idea that there's some artist or some creator who took the time to establish these permanent fixtures, conveying some meaning throughout eternity. But in reality, these aren't super special. There are more than 900 of them on this little island. And this particular Ahu was reassembled in the 1980s to captivate tourists. In my opinion, this is a more appropriate view of Rapa Nui culture. This is the backside of one of the Ahus, so behind us would be the ocean. Take a look at the far right side of the wall. I'll zoom in for you. And you'll find a Moai buried face first in the thickness of this wall. So Moai are not seen as sacred, eternal, or revered artifacts. They're seen as a resource, perhaps, but a stone resource in a landscape that's absolutely covered in stone. I'll return to this image because this is the landscape that these operate on, these like ankle busting stones everywhere. So they have plenty of stone, but they took this moment to recapture one of these Moai as a building material. So this is a real head scratcher for us today. Did the Rapa Nui not value their heritage? Is this some form of conquest? It's really quite strange. When the Dutch explorers first encountered that island, they asked the people of Rapa Nui how their ancestors could have possibly moved these stones. And the Rapa Nui told them, our ancestors did not move those stones. They said the stones walked themselves. And for centuries, this was dismissed as stone worship. But as it turns out, the Rapa Nui were telling the truth, because the statues known as Moai were transported standing, pivoting from side to side. As spectacular as the Moai are for visitors today, you have to imagine being there then, with colossal Moai marching around the island. Because the real memorial is not the objects themselves, it's the cultural ritual of bringing a stone to life. So that's what I've been doing. I've been chasing that dream of thinking about how we can shift our idea of construction to accommodate this mythical side. So I've been challenging myself with putting on these kinds of public performances of the ancient but very straightforward task of just moving and standing big heavy stones. Like this 16-foot tall statue designed to walk across land and stand under the limited strength of just a handful of graduate students at MIT who are not strong at all. Or this floating stone that swims horizontally under the bridges and drinks the very river water to stand upright. Or this 4,000-pound behemoth that springs itself to life to dance on stage. So in testing this problem over and over again, we obviously started to think about the perception of life in these objects, but we also started to think about the relationship between humans and how they engage with these inanimate beings. And at this point, you are rightfully asking yourself what any of this has to do with architecture and why you're listening to this weirdo talking about moving big heavy stones. But stick with me for just a bit. So I want to explain why I've been so fascinated with this mass and weight, because I have been haunted by this image. It's an absolutely spectacular piece of architecture, which is composed itself out of megaliths, raising the stakes beyond just thinking about how to transport and place one object and entering into questions of assembly and construction. So more recently, we've been asking ourselves the question of how we can embed the behavior of assembly into the objects themselves. And of course, we're trying to grapple with ideas of conflating these kind of practical ideas of assembly with more spiritual notions of ritual, experience, and community building, because these are all events that communities are invited to attend and experience, whether these things are going to crash into each other, whether it's going to work, whether it's going to break apart. And they do break apart every once in a while. But it's this relationship between the inorganic materials and the human experience that we're really after. So if we think about construction through the lens of efficiency, we think about how a brick is designed for a single mason to pick and place all day long. But walking assembly is not efficient at all, or at least not in those terms. It operates in an entirely different mindset. So for instance, these elements, they have so much inertia, this is solid concrete, that you could not possibly pick and place this. So the kind of standard mentality of construction will not really suffice in engaging these. You have to apply light but constant pressure in order to guide the elements in a manner that they also want to behave. So it's really more like being a dance partner than a worker. By embracing the myth that stones are alive, we're attempting to reimagine construction, not as a site for labor, but inserting wonder and whimsy. And we're doing that through very dumb exercises that interrogate questions of ritual, experience, theatricality, and play by just moving and standing big, heavy objects. I think one of the reasons I'm just so preoccupied with these ancient megalithic stone constructions is specifically prehistoric construction is just so incredibly different than the way that we think today, the way that we design today, and the way we build today. Because this is the way we practice today. With the majority of the world's population moving to urban centers, the vast majority of material that's housing that population is being cast of reinforced concrete, which, by the way, is not designed to last forever. And that begs the question, what on earth are we going to do with all this concrete? I hope everyone's up for a little eco-shaming today, but the default solution is not to recycle this concrete. Despite what greenwashing industries will tell us, the process of recycling concrete expends a massive amount of energy, only to grind that intelligent material down into a significantly downgraded aggregate. That's all you get out of this process. So to make matters worse, when you grind that material down, you're also releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. So in the end, the standard practice is to landfill all that rubble. So if you're demolishing any concrete buildings on this campus, it's going to a landfill. The contemporary building industry is addicted to new materials in an era that necessitates smarter practices. the concrete industry alone accounts for 8% of global CO2 emissions, with alarmingly little attention paid to the inevitable obsolescence of that material. I told you there's going to be some eco-shaming. It's not all fun and games, you know. So I want to ask the question with you. How does one reincorporate that material back into the building stock? Well, in the 1400s, Pope Nicholas V declared that the carcass of the Colosseum should be consumed to produce St. Peter's Basilica. Now imagine trying to do this today. It's like on one hand, you've got preservation, and on the other hand, you've got sustainability, fighting it out to figure out who's going to be able to maintain the Colosseum. But perhaps we're the odd ones, because the Romans are not the only civilization that recognized the value of a building's afterlife. I return to this image, because this is a dry stone wall at Sacsayhuaman in Cusco, Peru. It's a structure that's currently attributed to the Quechua and Inca cultures, but there's some evidence that it likely predates them. As cryptic and baffling as these random assemblies appear to us today, there is a key concept that we need to understand about them. The stones that compose this wall were not quarried. They were not pre-designed in the way that we think of design today. They were carefully selected from loose rock balls, or they were cannibalized from previous structures. As a concept, it's really interesting to think about how we can design things that can continue to live on beyond the 30 to 60 year timeline that we design our buildings. But when you look at the sheer mass and magnitude of these, it becomes quite overwhelming. It seems like humans could not have possibly built these structures because they didn't. These structures were carefully crafted by a primordial race of giants known as Cyclops. So I've been collaborating with these monsters, learning their secrets for moving these massive stones. And in addition to that, what we did as a research group was we contacted the descendants of Cyclops and we asked them for their family recipes. And we pulled that together and compiled those recipes into a book that we call the Cannibal's Cookbook. It walks the reader through the context of this problem as I just outlined, the history and the techniques of cannibalizing building materials, and then it provides a range of recipes shored up by the depths of ancient experience. And anyone can follow these. So we offer this to the building industry or anyone interested in a plausible path forward to retain the embodied energy of our buildings. So here's a recipe. This particular recipe is the one that produced this wall. And I know what you're thinking. It sounds great in theory, but there's no way we're going to build like this today. It's just not the way the building industry operates. So instead of just preaching that someone should do this, we decided to pick it up ourselves and test it out. So we built this wall. Each of the stones in this wall are salvaged from either demolition debris, so they're reinforced concrete demolition from a Motel 6, and they're also offcuts from the stone industry, which really only yields like 40% of the stone that it uses. And what we did was, and there's also quite a bit of offcuts from some of my colleagues' work, which was fun to play with. So what we did was we scanned those random pieces and we digitally optimized them with that ancient Inca algorithm to reassemble this new structure for today. As a research group, we always operate in two forms of media, like this in this example. One is in prototyping full-scale experiments, and you can think of these as like proof of concepts or explorations. And the other is in finding ways of disseminating that knowledge to others. So this particular project is operating in one trajectory, like it's focused on upcycling materials that in their former life had no knowledge of this new existence. But we're also interested in thinking about this from the other end of the spectrum. Like, how could we design architectures that are intended to be repurposed in the future? So let me just take a pause for a moment, because it might be useful to clarify that the work that we do at Matter Design is a critical project. It's questioning the default practices of the building industry on both ends of the lifespan. So we're not operating like a conventional architect that's interested in that 30 to 60 year timeline. We're interested in the time before the building and the time after the building. So on one end, we're talking about transportation, assembly, material sourcing, things like that. And on the other end, we're thinking about the buildings after. So we could think of this like lab work, not necessarily site work, but we're also interested in learning how some of these ideas can change the way we think about architecture's relationship to building community. But for example, this is an ongoing project. It's a rendering. Unfortunately, it's not built. We do not like making renderings. We do not like making drawings. We like making objects. We like making physical things at full scale. But this is a collaboration with the USMC Strategic Alliance. They're a community programmer that operates at the US-Mexico border. And this project was a particular challenge for us in thinking about an architecture that could be living. It needed to operate as a cultural center, but it needed to be malleable enough because the kinds of programs that this group puts on ranges in scale dramatically. They have this huge lot, but in thinking about a community center, they design for programs that range from like small dinner parties to quinceañeras to massive public speaking events that have hundreds of thousands of people. Like the Pope spoke at this location one time, obviously not with our piece there. But you know, not only is Akiaki interested in defining the dimensions of these spaces, which you can see in the plans, like trying to think about what are the various configurations, like how many different configurations can we get out of how few elements. So we're calibrating the center of mass so that these things can be pivoted by just one person. But beyond just thinking about those dimensions and engaging a range of programs, we're also interested in the semiotics and curiosity, wonder, and this kind of strange relationship between how the elements are currently configured and how they could be reconfigured in the future. So the details and the figures of these wall elements are attempting to tap into that imaginative range to suggest like this is a way that this thing can sweep and define a different space. So it's really attempting to find exploration with the user. And that's something I want to expand on a little bit in this next project because it's a play lab. It's developed in collaboration with the Grayson School in Radnor, Pennsylvania. They are an incredible progressive education group. And they came to us with a very clear mission. They said they'd like us to work together to reimagine what adolescent play really means and how adolescent play can be incorporated into learning objectives. So most notions of play really center on early childhood, like swings, slides, monkey bars. But when you're in middle school, you're not really interested in the swing or a slide. But you do start to tap into imaginative ideas of world building. I think that was the challenge that we were attempting to address. So we began by developing these things called glyphs that you're seeing clicking through the screen here. I lost my place, just a second. Yeah. So these glyphs, you can see that they're suggesting possible relationships between each other. They obviously also have a relationship to the human body, but there's no clear definition of one finite solution. Like there's no like deterministic idea of how these things should be used, but they have a memory of some type of utilitarian purpose. In addition to these glyphs, which were almost like conversation starters with the instructors and the students, we ultimately built a colossal set of concrete characters that are scattered throughout a field. And these characters strike alignments with each other, which you can see here in the plan, but when you're at eye level, it's not self-evident. But not only alignments with each other, but they also strike alignments with the cosmos and celestial bodies. So when we go to this section, you can see the scale with that the kid on the far right. And the question is really, how can we deposit objects that beg for curious discoveries? And the real goal of this is not about the objects themselves, but about how the students are going to engage with the objects, because the objects are really only getting you like 90% of the way. They don't do anything on their own. But these students have a fabrication lab. So the idea and the way that we're working with the school is that the students build out their own spaces depending on what's happening in their curriculum. So whether it's an active landscape or a set of physics experiments or a more communal space. And obviously this is a kind of bottomless pit for design, like design something that can be anything. But again, in concert with the Kia, I think what I'm trying to share is that there is this sweet spot between designing something that can flex and accommodate a few things as long as you can define what they are. And that's one of the things that we've been playing around with and thinking about that transformation through time and longevity, because I'm pretty sure those concrete things, they are anchored. There's more concrete underground than there is above ground, let me put it that way. So this is a valuable collaboration for us, because in the end, the design decisions that went into making these objects is also integrated directly into the curriculum of the school. And what do I mean by that? So over the course of their education, these students are going to be challenged to unpack the mysteries that are embedded in these concrete artifacts. And our goal was to create this in a way that the students had the same sense of discovery that an archaeologist would have in kind of unearthing some prehistoric observatory, because they know there are some mysteries embedded in these, and the curricular exercises are kind of tuned to challenge them and point them towards certain things, and then they find it on their own. So parallel to this play lab, we've also launched a research project called the Crop Circle Kit, which is an online platform. You can find it at cropcirclekit.org. And the idea here is that it's an online platform that offers lessons to like middle school, high school, and architecture students who are interested in engaging this act of drawing things at a colossal scale, but don't have access to that particular play lab. It's supposed to be fun and playful, but it's also rigorous. And maybe Joel, since you kind of teed up the question here, maybe I'll go on a slight diatribe to try and tie these things together, because if you're familiar with our early work at Matter Design, you would kind of classify us as digital fabricators. And like when I say that word, like you know what I mean. There is a thing called digital fabrication, and we did do that for a while. But now we're doing this play stuff and moving heavy stones, a little bit different. But fundamentally, I've been doing one thing this whole time, which is just trying to connect the way that we think and the way that we make. And the diatribe that I want to go off on here for just a second is to try and contextualize this within standard modes of architectural practice. Like the standard practice in architecture is to use orthographic projection to produce a set of construction documents at your desk. And you hand that over to a contractor and you say, figure it out. Notations can allow you to kind of skip over the rigors of geometry. Like you don't actually have to know how to construct the geometry yourself, as long as you add a note that says align these two walls to each other. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. It's just a particular mode, and we've become a monoculture in the field of architecture that this is how everyone is practicing architecture. I say everyone, most everyone, right? The problem with that is what it does is it divorces the builder from the designer. And over time, the methods by which we generate our designs are not in sync with the way things are being built. So what you're seeing here are just some animations from this crop circle kit that are sharing some of the kind of fundamental ways of creating geometries at colossal scales. I'll point to the second one on the top left, which is an ellipse. And I think to illustrate that point, if you, I don't know if you use Rhino or AutoCAD or Revit here, but most of these platforms, if you want an ellipse, you're 3 clicks away. And those 3 clicks have nothing to do with the way an ellipse is drawn in the field. So what I've been doing in my career is trying to stitch these things together. So however you're drawing corresponds with the way that it's being made. And if you want to integrate structural systems into the calculation, that is embedded. If you want to embed constraints of the fabrication process, that's embedded. So I think that the crop circle kit is a kind of natural extension of that core focus of bridging this gap between making sure that the way we're generating designs hold weight when you go out to a field. So I've been putting on these fun workshops. And the way this works is, there are a few ways of doing it, but basically one method is students begin at their desk and they make drawings with just string, right? No rulers, no 90 degrees, no computers, just string and some type of drawing device. And as they make geometries, they have to write the explicit instructions adjacent to their drawing. And after they've completed a drawing and after they have their script to produce that drawing, we hand the script to a classmate. And the classmate tries to reproduce the drawing without having the drawing itself. And at that point, obviously all kinds of errors and misunderstandings and flips and mirrors happen. But the point is that these students are learning computation without touching a computer. They're learning about recursive systems, they're generating their own loops, and they're developing their own language to share between the thinker and the maker. And after they get to a point where they feel their script is robust enough, they go out into a field and they try it at full scale. And when you go full scale, you can't fudge it, right? You have to have a rigorous method to be able to ensure that these things are going to align, because the drone is going to tell you, no, that something's off here. And you will see there are some errors in these things, unintended consequences of an unrigorous drawing system. So the video you're watching here, these are the results of a one-day workshop at the Louisiana State University, which leads me into some of the current work that I'm working on. I'm really excited to share this with you. This is an excerpt from a book that I'm working on titled Colossus and the Cosmos, trying to tap into some of these ideas of what are the origins of architecture? How could we expand the idea of educating foundations in architecture and explain, not explain, actually, I would say raise questions. So if you're interested about how any of these research projects start, this is the beginning of a research project, so please bear with me, it's rough. A small group of people are gathering on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River, and an elaborate construction project is underway. One by one, members of this community calmly and methodically set bundles of reed and cane on the site, lashing and weaving their contribution into a collective nest. There's no foreman on site. There are no laborers being ordered to speed up the pace. There's no sense of urgency at all. But the sun is setting and this fire is going to be necessary very soon. However, you don't make fire from reed and cane to stay warm or even to cook food. There's only one reason why you burn a fire that hot. And as the sun sets and the stars emerge overhead, the structure is lit. a plume of smoke billows out of this maelstrom of energy, launching a recently deceased member of the community into the heavens to join their ancestors in the Milky Way overhead. This ceremonial cremation is a bridge from life to the afterlife. It connects the earth to the cosmos. And as we're going to learn soon, the thoughtfulness behind this simple ritual will ultimately live on, spanning inconceivably vast distances and times. As the fire settles, a new performance takes place, with baskets of saturated mud depositing onto these hot embers, releasing a muffled hiss as the water turns into steam. As each basket is deposited, it's also compacted tightly, forming an incredibly solid mound, roughly the size of a human. Now, what is the significance of this tiny cremation mound? Well, a couple things. First, this event happened 11,300 years ago. That makes this the oldest known human-made structure in the Americas. 11,300 years. Stonehenge was 4,000 years after this was made. This mound predates the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca. It is truly ancient. But it's tiny, and I'm fascinated by big things. So why am I focused on this tiny little bump? Because the other thing that's significant about this mound is that the people didn't stop here. Because a couple years later, after traversing the continent of North America, they navigated their way back, and they did it again, and again, and again. And they kept that cycle up for another 256 years. Now, let's keep in mind, like, it's difficult to conceive, like 11,300 years, 256 years, but 256 years is longer than the United States has existed. That's 10 generations of people. So imagine creating a ritual where you know that 10 generations beyond you, these people are going to continue this. And it is not an easy practice, by the way. So that's the timescale that we're talking about with this construction, which is, I would say, significantly different than the way that we think about construction today. And this is no small feat. It's 26 feet tall, 130 feet basal diameter. That's not that big, but if you calculate how this is made, the material that produced this mound is sourced 5-minute walk down the bluff to the river. 5 minutes also doesn't seem that long, but if you account for the distance, the swelling of the uncompacted soil, the saturation of the soil, and an assumption that humans can carry about 50 pounds all day long, which is a huge assumption, it would take a laborer 16 years of nonstop work to commute the material from the river to the bluff. My point is that this mound represents an absolutely absurd amount of energy. So try and convince your descendants to keep this up, right? How was this possible? What happened? And the other thing that's amazing about this is they didn't stop here, because directly, this is real, by the way. Okay, I know I'm talking about mythological creature. This is real. This happened. Adjacent to that mound is another, almost identical mound. And yet the material that composes that mound is not sourced from the river. It's sourced a 10-minute walk in the opposite direction. So what does that mean? Is the earth somehow connected to the cremated individual? Are they imparting a direction that we need to follow? Is it pointing us somewhere? Is it about the journey? I mean, we can keep asking these questions, right? but someone is speaking to us from 11,000 years ago, 500 generations ago. And these two mounds are not even unique because there are tens of thousands of these mounds scattered throughout North America, from the Gulf of Mexico up to Canada, containing material from Alaska to Maine. And this is a practice that spans millennia, ranging in form from conic mounds like these to effigies and constellation clusters reflecting the stars overhead. And they strike these incredible alignments with each other across the distances of states. So this is our indigenous architecture. It was so baffling to the European settlers, especially because the Native Americans had no idea who built these mounds. But now that we know that they were built so long ago, it is equivalent to asking like a medieval European who painted the Lascaux caves, you know? So where are these two mounds? They're actually on the Louisiana State University's campus. You can visit them. If you go, oh, and by the way, so LSU is a land grant institution, which kind of compounds this problem because it's founded on the very earth that these mounds emerged from. And if you go to LSU, you will find entirely new rituals taking place on these mounds. These rituals range from sliding down them on cardboard, red wagons, and even inflatable sex dolls. One way of looking at this is at least rituals are still taking place on these mounds. You know, I have a hard time like accepting that, but there is something about the mounds that is kind of like requesting these kind of rituals through time. They just look like bumps in the landscape until you kind of understand the significance of them. So it's hard to look past that judgment. But this is, thank you for letting me share this, because this is the beginning of a research project. These are the kinds of questions that come out. And now the question is like, how does one explore these ideas and how do they challenge the way that we think about architecture today? So as you begin to think about your own questions, I just want to pose a couple myself. So first, what is the value of ritual? The piece that fascinates me so much about the story of this simple cremation mound is that such a, like we could say, simple ceremony, a ceremony that happened through one fire, was significant enough that it convinced people to continue to that site and do the very arduous task of constructing that mound. And there's a practice that lasted 256 years. So even to think about maintaining a construction for that long is one thing, but the mounds are also still there 11,300 years from now. And we're in a society that is struggling to make buildings that can last 100 years, let alone 11,300 years. So as architects, designers, and landscape architects, we have very little experience with ritual today, but we do make lots of mounds. They just have very little relationship to culture other than consumer culture. So what could we learn from the mound builders of North America in considering our legacy and marking the earth? So there's plenty of finger wagging here, but that's not my intention at all, because what I'm really after is not the contrast between the ancient and the contemporary. I'm trying to find the commonalities. Because if there's some kind of resonance between a crisis that we face today and a practice that we've lost to amnesia, then that means that there's something fundamental, there's something terrestrial, and there's something very human about this question. And if we can connect on that level, then we can build a bridge that's 11,300 years deep, right? Connecting us as humans to these societies that we too often write off as being just primitive. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. We've covered a range of scales, single stones to assemblies and landform creations. And in the end, I hope it's clear that These explorations are not about the artifacts themselves. They're about the cultures and practices that surround these enigmas. Practices that challenge us to rethink our own approaches to topics that range from labor to energy and education. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take any questions you have. I feel like the price is right now. Come on down.
All right. So never spoken to these things. So it seems that whether you were speaking about the stones from the beginning or these practices, that you're very concerned with time, and maybe even more than time, the dedication and commitment that's been taken by humans to build certain things. And this is actually something that I've thought about a lot, especially when I'm in my history classes, about why we're so fascinated by buildings from hundreds of years ago. And I think that the answer is time. And the reason that architecture today isn't that interesting, in my opinion, is because it's built in such a rush. And it's very easy to talk about it and say that that's the answer. But in the world that we're living, it's so capitalist and so fast paced and so focused on the bottom line that how can you even actually apply these concepts, which I think they're great, to the real world, and convince people to actually build things that matter.
Right.
I don't know if you have an answer, because I've thought about it.
No, I don't have an answer, but I have the same questions because when I was going on the diatribe before, like lamenting this kind of standard practice of construction documents, I also just don't enjoy making construction documents, so it could be a little bit of that. But I think it is worth saying that there are certain values that do come out of standard practice. Like it's very efficient, it's fast, and it's kind of amazing that we can make drawings with the assumption that we will have this kind of limitless supply chain delivering standardized building materials to a site. And that's the way this practice operates. And I think what we should recognize is that that mode of thinking is born out of a very particular moment in time, which is capitalist first, and it's also post-industrial. It's the idea of we're going to pump things out. But in taking those values, the great benefits, and if I was designing a house, I would definitely follow some of those benefits as well, because I would like an inexpensive construction for the value that I'm getting. We obviously are also missing out on some other values. So like the digital fabrication boom operated under the same challenges that you're offering today, which is like, how are you going to shift the building industry? Because the building industry operates under mass production, and you're talking about mass customization. And now we see so many buildings going up where mass customization is essentially a standard practice, that BIM is incorporated directly into the building industry. Now, I don't know if I can draw a parallel between the behemoth of the digital fabrication boom and this kind of work in ancient techniques and methods, but the information already exists. So I can give an example, which is some of the Inca construction. For instance, the Inca didn't have slave labor. They had tribute labor. So the way you pay your taxes to the Inca, who are the ruling class, is you would submit the best mason you had to go to site, and the Inca were essentially like public works commissioners. They say, we need a wall over here for society, and you're coming to pay your taxes. So as you do that, you pay your taxes. They would actually exert a tremendous amount of skill so that they could prove, I did that, I can tell you how I did it, here it is. And there are moments in time. So what I'm trying to identify is a cultural shift that also necessitates an architectural like rethink. So there's a temple, it's called Ollantaytambo. There's a moon temple there. And the Inca had a particular problem at that moment in history where they didn't have enough public works projects for the amount of taxes that they were taking in. So they designed a temple that had no end date in sight. And it was just a continual construction project to absorb those tax funds. So we could look at that as a waste, but as archaeologists look at it, it's a gold mine of understanding something that's transformed through time. I don't know. So like I said, I actually don't have an answer of a direct application, but I also don't view my contribution as finding those finite solutions. I'm more trying to raise and find the perimeters and like, if this is the bounds with which our architecture is operating, what's happening at the periphery. And I can say there are a lot of questions that exist there, but I don't have a whole lot of answers about what's going to come.
So do you think we're condemned as architects to fall into the same system of just fast-paced building, low quality materials? I mean, is there a way to like insert that into the economy that we live in?
Well, I don't think we have a choice. I don't think the future is going to allow for an endlessly extractive industrial process where we are constantly absorbing new building materials. I don't see that as a viable future. We've hit critical mass. So the landfills that we're constructing right now, I mean, I think there needs to be a critical lens on thinking that's the kind of eco-shaming side. But I think my point is that these solutions have actually already been solved. You know, like if we think that there's this arduous process of like, how are we going to ever combat climate change? But the solutions exist in history. So that's what I'm doing, is trying to do this.
Okay, thank you.
Hello. Could you talk a little bit about maybe the tensions between participation and performance in your projects? Because it seems like maybe it's a cultural limitation on how we view safety and around these kind of large things, but it seems performance has a kind of connotation that there's practice involved. People are practicing, moving around these things, understanding how they're going to work, which kind of limits the ability for random people to participate in some of the kind of cultural participation you want to do, which I think is probably most clear in the Grace and Play Lab, where you can imagine if these things were able to move around the field for children, would be a very exciting project, but most likely are limited because you don't want children to get hurt. Whereas at the same time, that's actually probably one of the best ways for children to learn how not to get hurt is to get injured in the first place.
Yeah, this, well, you raise a really great point, because I think there are two separate things. Like, one is a prescriptive performance where you're kind of, you're performing that act as a way of trying to learn something from that process. And part of it is like, one way of thinking about performance is you're doing that to please someone else. There's an audience, right? But many of the performances are about like creating the code, like in the way that I was talking about the crop circles, like sitting down and thinking deliberately about how this performance is going to lay out, how you're going to tell a story, and forcing design decisions as a result of that deliberate, like beginning, middle, and end. So, you know, if the majority of architectural education is focused on formal, I'm trying to insert temporal, right? Like just have a script. The other side is about interaction and designing things that kind of entice engagement. And I think a lot of the things like that, the wobbling, it's called Janus, the big wobble stone, is it's catastrophically dangerous if you get under it. But people want to touch it, and you can get it to move pretty easily. So it is an anxiety-inducing idea, like this this relationship between interaction and just the mass and the logistics of safety is something that we've kind of always dealt with, especially when we're doing stuff in play. But yeah, I would categorize them as two separate things, because the interaction thing is one where you design an object and you sit back and you witness people engaging with it. You're always surprised by how that happens, and scale changes things too. So when you make a colossal Janus, you get a certain kind of engagement, but if you make a mini Janus, you get another kind of engagement, which is like more through the body and the arm. So that's where we're kind of paying attention to like how humans are engaging with things. So the walking assembly project had a lot to do, it wasn't a performance, it was like this just engagement, a lot of recording, a lot of asking different people to engage it. So it's really like absorptive, where you make the thing and then you try and see what happens, and then you recalibrate and you see what happens, and you just go back and forth. Whereas the performance is almost always deliberate, it's scripted through time.
So then I guess one follow-up question to that would be, if a lot of these objects are built about kind of human engagement, what is their post-life? Do they live somewhere in a factory? Do they go somewhere, or how does that work?
They are stored in warehouses, especially during the pandemic, but they're exhibited. So Janus is going to be exhibited in Detroit in September, and it will be in Atlanta this summer. But yeah, they hop around. So there's this other side, like there's like, I did a lot of eco shaming, so I'll shame myself now, because like we're often air freighting these things, which is kind of insane. The other thing is the Cyclopean cannibalism wall was that wall that recycled building materials. We worked with a stone fabricator called Cora Stone in Madison, Wisconsin, and they got some of the concrete from a Motel 6 down the street, and then they had a lot of the offcuts of the stone. They did all of the robotic work, and then they dry set it in their factory, and then we shipped it to Seoul, Korea for a biennial. So there's the absurdity of the recycling of things, and the just sheer logistics of making these things happen. But unfortunately, they do move around the earth and have quite a carbon footprint. Yes.
Hello. Thank you for your lecture. I was wondering, you mentioned recycling concrete and also the compounding effect of these rituals. And I was wondering if there's a way to kind of engage a more primitive joinery or cut in these materials for more, I guess, more accessibility or mass production. Do you have something to comment about that?
I'm getting really excited because we're working on something along those lines right now that I think I'm very excited about, but it's like too stupid to really like lay out. But there, I will share. We have done, for instance, there's a project we did called Round Room. This middle piece right there. This is it's an Inca polygonal wall, Cyclopean masonry. It's often described as being like such a precise fit that you can't fit a razor blade or a sheet of paper between, but really that's only at the front edge, and behind it, it opens up. So they're really only aligning that front visible face and then packing mortar in from behind. So we did a project where we experimented with carving pieces that would align on that front face, and then similar to something that Guastavino used was like piping in plaster, almost like icing for a cake from behind, and it holds it like within a minute. So you just kind of hold it in place, and then it stays in three-dimensional space. So if you're interested in that, I would point you, we wrote a paper on that you can find on our website, or I can share later. But we're also interested in some other ideas of just joining, because let's say the most fundamental problem of a post-extractive future is how are we going to join things that are not universally flat? right? They're random pieces, or they were originally intended to be detailed one way, and now we need to use it in another way. So yes, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of work that can be done in that simple tectonic problem of joining two things together.
Hi. So I was wondering, because I've been trying to track the variables that you've been mapping out for us, and clearly time is one of them, and time is both an historical arc, but it's also an investment.
Yeah.
And there's also scale and mass, and also energy. And energy manifests itself in a bunch of different ways, and you track them for us. But then there's another variable that is less spoken about, but implicit in all of them. And that might be in a very abstract way, say, is cultural content.
Yes.
And that's the one that seems the most significant and the least directly addressed.
Right.
Can we directly address that now?
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. I mean, perhaps in one of the motivations behind the public performances is, well, let me use Amish barn raisings as an example, right? A practice that is, if you just wanted to make a barn, there are many ways of doing that, but the particular cultural gathering of an Amish barn raising embeds a meaning into that barn throughout eternity. So the memory of that act is, I think, one of the things that I'm trying to tap into also in these mound building projects, because it's not just that they made a mound, right? These things were incrementally made, and there's clearly something, and we don't have all the evidence of exactly what took place, but we can kind of imagine. We know a few things about them. We know that there was an ash layer and that there was cremation with some type of mammal material, reed and cane, that cremation happened 11,300 years ago. And then we know that it was incrementally constructed because of a core sample that Brooks Elwood took just a couple years ago. And that just, the idea that you would construct something incrementally is not unique to that mound. Like almost all mounds in North America were done incrementally. So if you were applying our contemporary, like we have blinders. I mean, I think we have to understand that we operate with particular biases, like any society. And we have blinders where, and I'm prone to this myself, I'm arguing for mass and structure and logistics of assembly and carbon capture, and all these things that can be quantified. But the part that I'm not qualified to engage with is the sociological side, the kind of spiritual side. And that's the thing that is really quite new in my research. I think that's like just the past 5-6 years. And that, I have to say, that first megalithic studio was a collaboration with Mark Jarzenbeck, who's a historian. And Mark essentially launched me into this question of stone architecture because he said something that shattered me at the beginning of my career, which was that throughout history, you can track how well a society is doing by their ability to precisely carve stone. And we do not precisely carve stone today. We clad buildings in a veneer of stone. And that was telling me, well, we have some work to do. So I've been working on stone since then, but it wasn't until 2015 that I did that collaborative studio where we started saying, okay, let's do a ritual, let's do a performance. Let the stone live, you got to let it live. And that just opened up an entirely different way of thinking about these things and the way that you design them. So I wouldn't say that I had those answers yet, but I'm with you because that is the most powerful contribution of this. And it's a little bit too ephemeral for me at the moment, but I think it would also explain why I'm interested in doing things like a play lab with an education group, people that are studying the engagement of students with physical things. I'm working on that. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it.
There were some questions in the chat as well. Maybe I'll try to proffer one and maybe paraphrase it a little bit and see if it's productive. But yeah, there's several questions, and I don't think we'll get to all of them because we're running low on time. But one speaks specifically as I'll quote them first. I'm wondering how you balance think about the influence of high tech and prehistoric tech in your work. I think that I would expand that question a little bit, right? I mean, I think that there's a kind of some of the questions that we got today were about what this means for contemporary architects who don't want to be participating in the version of architecture that exists today, right? And yet we are all, of course, in the context of a particular, not just economic system as we've described, but obviously ecological circumstances, like we're subject to all of these influences, right? And certainly we are ensconced within a certain kind of technological realm that also limits how we can behave and how we can do architecture, right? And so this question between the prehistoric and high tech so-called, I would also ask you to try to maybe address not just the idea that somehow ritual is the difference which distinguishes these other things from the contemporary, but all of these other kinds of contexts that we have so much less control over generally, right? Like that we are kind of embedded in a specific moment. Yeah. And whether you think that this kind of interest in the prehistoric, whether others have criticized this interest as a kind of nostalgia, or a kind of like a rejection of the contemporary without maybe internalizing all of the complexities of the systems in which we're embedded.
It's a really great question. It's one that we grapple with a lot because I think I personally am not nostalgic, but I think definitely reverent or appreciative of pieces that we cannot, perfectly explain with the way that we operate today. So there are certain values that are inherent in these things, like those gargantuan cyclopean masonry walls. You cannot look at it without awe. So we think of them as like wonders, like how were these things made? There's a ring mound in Newark, Ohio, and you can see this. You can see the mound at Stonehenge on the right. It's actually that's what a henge is. It's a gully of water with a mound surrounding it. And there's a ring mound in Newark, Ohio that contains 33 acres of land inside of it. And it strikes a perfect horizontal. So if you stand in the middle, you get this perfectly horizontal line around the horizon, ideal for celestial observatory. And I think there's something to appreciate about that. So that's what I've spent my time doing, is trying to identify, like, what are we missing out on today with our contemporary blinders? What could we learn from that? But the key for me is never to replicate. I think the closest we get to replication is like the cyclopean masonry wall. Even though it was done digitally, it certainly is replicating that appearance. And there are certain bits that I think that's the closest thing we would get to what would be called experimental archaeology. But you'll notice that we didn't, for instance, scan and cast a Moai form and walk it across campus. We translated ancient knowledge into a contemporary practice. So we're always trying to figure out how to adapt, like how could we merge that knowledge from the past with resources that we have today. And that's that tricky moment that slips us beyond nostalgia, I hope. Like that's what we tell ourselves, at least. But it's certainly a decision that we have to make pretty regularly, because there are so many things, like doing the experimental archaeology is sometimes necessary to know when something doesn't have its place today and what to be left behind. And it's a constant challenge that we work with. It's a really great question.
Okay, I think that is time, but Brandon, thank you so much. This was a delight.
Thanks for having me.